Welcome, everyone, to this live webinar. It's just a minute or so after 12 o'clock noon in the Eastern time zone. I'm Roger Ream of the Fund for American Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. Our topic today is, are Reagan and Reaganism still relevant in the age of Trump? And we have two excellent people joining me to talk about this topic: Governor Scott Walker, the president of Young America's Foundation, and David Boaz, the executive vice president of the CATO Institute. I will first introduce Governor Scott Walker, president of Young America's Foundation. As all of you should know, Governor Walker served as the 45th governor of the state of Wisconsin, which is my home state, from 2011 to 2019. He took on the unions in Wisconsin and pushed through many reforms into the legislature that have helped make Wisconsin much more fiscally stable and on solid footing, and reformed the education system to the benefit of students in Wisconsin. He, as president of Young America's Foundation, has responsibility for, among many other things, the Reagan Ranch in California, as well as in Santa Barbara, California, as well as now Reagan's boyhood home in Dixon, Illinois. So Young America's Foundation, while teaching young people today about our rich heritage and liberty, is also a caretaker for much of the Reagan legacy. So I will ask him to begin, and then I'll come back on and introduce David Boaz next. Governor Walker, could you offer your thoughts on this topic, please?
Great. Thanks, Roger. Thanks so much to you and the team at the Fund for American Studies for putting this on and for allowing me and David to join. I appreciate the fact that the connections with you and David, both being Yaffers, part of our alums. And I suppose looking at your shelf there, you should note that, Roger, you and I are probably in a little bit of mourning because we'd like to have woke up this week thinking the Green Bay Packers were on their way back to another Super Bowl, but that's a discussion for another day. But it's great to be with all of you and all the people tuning in. I would just echo what Roger said. I'm particularly looking forward to Q&A after David and I are completed. But think about this subject. I came of age under Ronald Reagan. I was just a kid when he was first elected in 1980. So like a lot of people in my generation, Gen Xers, we think of Ronald Reagan, and that's our president. I have to say, other than my parents, I don't think any other human being had a greater influence on my life and who I am, not just as a conservative, but in particular as an optimist, which is part of why not only then, but even more so drawn, as you mentioned, to be a part of YAF, which now is a part of that legacy, protecting and preserving the ranch and now the boyhood home. But more than just that, we're going to talk for a couple minutes about three principles that were key to his time, not only in 8 years as he was president, but throughout his public life. And that is lower taxes, limited government, and a strong national defense. I'm going to spend a minute or two on each. But what I love about Reagan is that he talked to big ideas. Even when he was president, he talked about things like the shining city on the hill, images about America and his love for this country, his eternal optimism in the American people, in sharp contrast to what he saw at the time, particularly not just within our nation, but from foreign foes, like the evil empire that were the communist leaders in the old Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries, and define things very clearly. I remember going into one of the negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev. They asked what his strategy was. He said simply, we win, they lose. It was that clear. That's his approach was as simple yet as profound as that. But as I was thinking about the topic for today, what I love when we do events with Young America's Foundation is that we're not exclusively about Ronald Reagan, but we obviously, because of our assets that we have, oftentimes talk about him. And last year, as we do often at the end of October, we highlighted Reagan's speech, A Time for Choosing, which for many of us sets the mark. It was actually given before I was even born. But I went back and I love sharing it with our young people because it's just as relevant today as it was when it was given right before the 1964 presidential campaign. Reagan wasn't even in office at the time. He didn't become governor until a few years later. But he clearly spelled out in that speech what it meant from his point of view to be a conservative. I obviously spent a little bit of time, although much of the speech was not about it, but he did talk about Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential nominee at the time, more from a personal level, about his personal attributes more than just his policies. But I pulled out the line that I thought was worth repeating. It was simple. This one paragraph, he told the story, quote, "Not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, 'We don't know how lucky we are.' And this Cuban stopped and said, 'How lucky you are. I actually had someplace to escape to.' And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth." That was directly from a quote, I should say, from A Time for Choosing, but it could be just as well given today, even including someone coming from Cuba as we speak. And that was the contrast. Again, why I think he's timeless. The speeches he's given, the ideas he talked about, again, limited government, strong national defense, and lower taxes. Of course, we're proud. Reagan signed the largest tax cut in American history just months after an assassin tried to take him out. In August of 1981, he signed it. And I love the imagery. Largest tax cut in American history. Where did he sign it? Not in Washington, not with a bunch of politicians standing behind him. He signed it at the Reagan Ranch, his home, during his entire time in the White House and thereafter. He signed it with his dog by his side, with a cowboy hat on and blue jeans. Why? Because this mattered more to everyday Americans and the houses they lived in than it mattered to the White House. But he understood if you give people back more of their hard-earned dollars, it will work. It will ultimately be re-energized not only in the incomes and economies of individual households, but of small businesses and other employers across this nation. You look at the changes that were made, not just in terms of lower taxes in 81 and again, particularly in 86, but the regulatory reforms, the changes that were made to empower the American job creator. On average, you had over 4.5% annual growth in the economy, and GDP adjusted for inflation during the 1980s. You saw nearly 19,000 new jobs were created during that time frame, not because the government played a direct hand, but rather because the government got out of the way. So lower taxes, limited government, you understood that that was good economic policy. Just as impressive, though, was his stand, not just on a strong national defense, but on peace through strength. The principle of restoring, a restoration of our US military power, not with the intent to use it, but rather with the intent to not have to use it. Probably the most classic of that was when he went to Reykjavik, and there may have only been two people in those discussions who believed in the Strategic Defense Initiative. One was Reagan, and the other, after listening to Reagan, was clearly Gorbachev. That brought about what at the time, again, a lot of young people may not fully appreciate today, but for those of us who grew up then, the end of the Cold War started after the Second World War and really lasted until the end of the Reagan presidency, going into 1989 and the early 90s, when Reagan, as has been affectionately pointed out, essentially won the Cold War without firing a shot. He knew that we had to have military capacity, focused on restoring our might, but not with the intent of using it, but rather with the intent of creating that sense of peace. In fact, that's how he sold the SDI. His critics called it Star Wars, but the idea of being protected from nuclear proliferation, the idea of mutually ensured destruction. Many of us grew up doing, even as school kids, going through the drills, not only for tornadoes, but what would happen if we had to go to a nuclear fallout shelter. Those things were gone after Ronald Reagan stood up to communism and brought about the end of the Cold War. So when I think of what I liked about Ronald Reagan before, I think it's just as relevant today. I particularly think so on a personal level. Now, I know there's all different personalities out there, but what I loved about Reagan was he was a happy warrior. It's something we like to pass on to the young people we work with today, that you can be strong and bold and courageous. You can be locked into a strong conservative point of view. I think one that's relevant now more than ever, when you look at the past 2 years of COVID and the idea that there clearly have been people at the federal, state, and local level who believe that there needs to be greater emphasis on putting our belief in power in the hands of the government, versus those of us who come of age under Reagan believing that we should put our faith and belief in the American people, in the individual and the American family. And I think now more than ever, that's as clear as could be, and why you've seen a resurgence, particularly amongst blue collar workers in this country, people who were drawn, the so-called Reagan Democrats, to Ronald Reagan, particularly in the 1980 and 84 elections. I think that's even more true now as they understand that the people who sought to close down their business and particularly close down their schools, they didn't have a choice but to go to work and had to wonder where to send their children. Those were the folks who believe in the government. The rest of us who put our faith in them, the individuals and the families of America, are the ones who are going to lead this nation going forward. That's certainly something that Ronald Reagan burned in over and over and over. The last point I'll take to share with it before we turn it back over to you, Roger, and then to David, and open up the questions, is if you look, and I would encourage everyone, Google Ronald Reagan's farewell address. January of 1989, he gave a farewell address to the nation. Rightfully so, he talked a lot about what had been established, what had been accomplished over the prior 8 years, remarkable economic growth and recovery, a sense of restoration of the American spirit and patriotism and belief in this country. But as Reagan often did, he didn't use it solely as an opportunity to pat himself in the back, but rather give a warning for the future. A warning that talked about, even though our spirit was back, we weren't reinstitutionalizing it. He warned the parents of children going into the 1990s, so the millennials of today, that we needed to reestablish that, and specifically gave us a charge to go back and do more to reinforce American history and shared civic rituals. We would be well suited to follow that advice yet today, and why Reagan is just as relevant, I think, now as he's ever been. So with that, Roger, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Governor Walker. It looks like we've lost Roger with an internet connection, so I'm going to jump in on his behalf. My name is Laura Cusack. I'm the Director of the Public Policy and Economics Program at the Fund for American Studies. And I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, David Boaz. He's the Executive Vice President of the CATO Institute and has played a key role in the development of the CATO Institute and the Libertarian movement. He's the author of The Libertarian Mind, a manifesto for freedom, and the editor of The Libertarian Reader. With that, I will turn it over to you, David. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Roger, wherever you are. As you heard in my biography, I write books on libertarianism, but I was a teenage conservative. I started a YAF chapter at Vanderbilt. I would like to take some credit for bringing Ronald Reagan to Vanderbilt, but I think that was really all Roger Ream. I became the first employee of Young America's Foundation back in 1975, and I edited YAF's magazine. And when I met Ronald Reagan during that period, he told me he liked my magazine, so that was nice. But eventually, I came to believe that conservatives were inconsistent in their defense of freedom, and so I became a libertarian. And since then, I've thought a lot about libertarianism, conservatism, modern liberalism, and some much worse ideas. And so I want to go back well before Reagan and talk about sort of the history of political ideas in the Western world. Liberalism, what we now call classical liberalism, arose in the 17th and 18th centuries in response to the old regime of absolute monarchy. And in those days, liberalism was associated with John Locke, Adam Smith, the American founders, John Stuart Mill, among others. Encyclopedia Britannica defines liberalism as a political doctrine focused on protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual. But then in the late 19th century, and especially in the 20th century in the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, liberalism came to mean something different. It came to mean activist government with high taxes and transfer programs and economic regulations, still with a slowly growing commitment to civil rights and civil liberties. And so in response to that Roosevelt kind of liberalism, the conservative movement began to emerge in the 1950s And conservatism, as defined by William F. Buckley Jr., Barry Goldwater, and Ronald Reagan, offered a program of free markets, traditional values, and a strong national defense. Some people called that fusionism, a fusion between classical liberalism and traditionalism. And so where do libertarians fit in this spectrum? Well, libertarianism is the philosophy of freedom, both personal and economic. Libertarianism is the idea that you should be free to live your life as you choose, so long as you respect the equal rights of others. And obviously, there's some overlap there with modern liberals on free speech and personal freedom issues, and with conservatives on free markets and limited government. And those were kind of the opposing factions, the FDR liberals and the Buckley Reagan conservatives, from the 1960s until about 2015. And then along came Donald Trump. And Trump didn't really campaign on free markets, traditional values, and a strong national defense. In fact, he didn't really agree with conservatives on free markets. He didn't show much interest in traditional values, and he had a very different view of what America's national defense should be. Much of his campaign was based on culture war, racial and religious scapegoating. He was committed to being opposed to free trade and immigration. As I say, I'm a libertarian, but I've always believed that the best aspect of American conservatism is its commitment to protecting the individual liberties proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence and guaranteed in the Constitution. And Ronald Reagan spoke for that brand of conservatism. And that's the conservatism that seems to have disappeared in today's Washington and today's Republican Party. And I'm worried about this new kind of conservatism, call it Trumpism or American greatness or national conservatism, because it doesn't seem to me that it is the limited government conservatism that served America well. It's different in both style and substance. Substantively, national conservatives reject the idea of free markets and limited constitutional government. You hear some of the leading national conservatives saying things like, we need to unapologetically embrace the use of state power. Their whole way of thinking is a class struggle of us against them and of identity politics, not the identity politics of the woke, but sort of the identity politics of the anti-woke. One of the leading national conservative theorists says market economies do not automatically allocate resources well across sectors. Well, that's what Buckley Reagan conservatives used to think it did. So they want protectionism and Buy America policies, corporate welfare, industrial policy, government-directed investment, a bigger welfare state. They want the government to step up antitrust, regulate online speech, and break up big companies. And the results of that program would be higher prices, less investment, fewer jobs, and more people dependent on a bigger government. Now, I said there were differences in both substance and tone. When I think of Reagan and Reagan's tone as a political leader, it's just like Scott said. It was a confident, optimistic patriotism. His last words to America were, I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. But when I listen to Trump and Tucker Carlson and the national conservatives, I don't think they have that optimistic, patriotic view of America. They think they sort of like some distorted idea of 1950s America. They don't like our dynamic, growing, multicultural world. When you listen to them, they're talking about American carnage and a nation in decline and a war on the West. As Scott was saying about Reagan's final speech as president, Reagan welcomed immigrants in that speech. He said, we lead the world because unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength from every country and every corner of the world. Donald Trump, on the other hand, said the United States is becoming a dumping ground for the world, letting in drugs and crime and rapists. That's a very different tone of patriotism. Reagan liked Margaret Thatcher. Trump and the Trumpists like Viktor Orban Erdogan and Putin, three dictators in our modern world. And I think Trump and the national conservatives are wrong to be so angry and resentful and pessimistic. There are plenty of injustices in the world to fight, but we should not forget that we still live in a world of freedom and progress. We have extended the promises of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to people to whom they had long been denied. Around the world, more people in more countries than ever before in history enjoy religious freedom, personal freedom, democratic governance, the freedom to own and trade property, the chance to start a business, equal rights, civility, respect, a higher standard of living, and a longer life expectancy. War, disease, violence, slavery, and inhumanity have been dramatically reduced. And it is liberty-minded people, classical liberals, libertarians, free market, Reaganite conservatives, and good free speech liberals who have made that happen. And our job for the next generation should be to extend liberty, not to roll it back. And that's why I would like to see a revival of Reagan limited government conservatism that I think has fallen out of favor among Republicans and conservatives these days.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both very much. I apologize for getting knocked. I got knocked off the internet for a bit and I missed some of what you said, Scott. I'll first want to, I actually like you, Governor Walker, to maybe respond, but if I could ask David, you a quick question. I think it's a quick question, but since you mentioned the word fusionism, I'll use it in a different sense, and that is there still the possibility of a fusionism between libertarians and liberals, or are we finding liberals so many liberals seem to have gone to the progressive side and no longer necessarily embrace free speech? Obviously, there are those liberals out there, old-fashioned liberals, who do embrace free speech, but it seems to me that the opportunity for common cause with people on the left is certainly diminished today versus, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah, if I do a longer version of that kind of talk, I definitely talk about my concern about the rise of illiberalism on both right and left. And I do see on the right this turn away from free markets and turn away from respecting the institutions of American democracy. And on the left, absolutely more Democrats willing to call themselves socialists and actually call for some socialist ideas, and a really bad attitude toward free speech and toward restricting any expression of ideas that they believe challenge other values that they have, certainly including racial and gender equality. I do think that there are still free speech liberals with whom I disagree on a lot of economic issues, but who genuinely do believe in freedom of speech. And we see that in the rise of organizations like FIRE and the Academic Freedom Alliance that are speaking out against attempts to restrict students and professors' freedom of speech. But it does seem harder to find those people, and so I don't think the solution is to go illiberal on the other side, but libertarians feel lonelier than ever.
Scott, would you like to add anything or
Sure.
kind of respond to what David has said?
Yeah, a couple quick thoughts. One, just on that last point, you're right. There's a handful now. It seems to be most are in the area of comedy. Bill Maher, some of the other comedians who woke up to the idea that if you don't have free speech, for a lot of them, that puts them almost out of business. But they're the far and few in between. Ironically, in the past, we sought to bring Ben Shapiro to the University of California, Berkeley, which people know their history. Now, Berkeley was like the home of the free speech movement decades ago. And yet they didn't outright oppose it. What they did was they put these ridiculous restrictions on. And when YAF sought to work with the local students and bringing them in, said they couldn't advertise couldn't have been after 3 p.m, charged security fees that were multiple times larger than any other group on campus. We went to court. We ultimately prevailed. They had to settle, change their policy. Good news is if we can win in Berkeley, we can win anywhere. But to that point, from a purist standpoint, looking at the Constitution, free speech is guaranteed. But most frustrating, it should be not only guaranteed, it should be revered on our college campuses. Yet that's where it's most at risk. So many of the people, so many of the tenured professors and administrators who fought for free speech as liberals back decades ago are now the people infringing on it for anyone who's even remotely center right. And so this is going to be an ongoing battle, not just for YAF, but I think for any number of other organizations. Quick other couple of things. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
No, if I'm finished off on that point, and then I'll come back for a second. That's fine, David.
All right. Well, I was going to add one little point, which is 2 or 3 years ago, well, before the pandemic, so 3 or 4 years ago, let's say, Students for Liberty at Berkeley invited me to speak. And I kept saying, I'm not seeing anything about advertising the speech. And then, well, we don't have the details worked out. Finally, it turned out they were told by the student government, there is no room available at Berkeley's campus that Wednesday night for you to hold a meeting in. So I looked, it was a darn big campus. I can't believe there wasn't a room, but I gave my speech at a coffee shop off campus.
No, you're right, David. That we routinely do that. I mean, think about it. We even had at a state government-run institution, university in New York, had Art Laffer come. Now, Art's a great guy. He speaks for us occasionally. His grandkids are actually in some of our programs. He's about as jovial a guy you can get talking about economic freedom. And at that campus, even though we forewarned them, radical activists came and essentially shut him down. And the campus police, through the orders of the administration, didn't take the activists, the agitators out. They actually took Dr. Laffer out and removed him from the place. So this is really, I think, to your point, anyone who truly believes in free speech, regardless of their political beliefs, has got to be concerned about this, because if it can happen one way, it certainly can be shifted. It's why, in general, one of the things we stress, and I think, David, it goes well to some of the points you raised, is we point out with our students all the time that the left, increasingly, when they engage in a debate, they don't debate the substance. They immediately go to a name. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. It could be you're a racist, sexist, transgender, homophobic, Neanderthal, you name it, regardless of what the topic is. You see this, for example, on voter integrity issues. It's immediately about race, even though the overwhelming majority of Americans, for example, think photo ID requirement, including 3/4 of Black voters, think that that's a reasonable accommodation to ensure the integrity of votes. They immediately brand it as racist. I say our retort as conservatives, or at least as me and conservatives we work with, shouldn't be to come up with our own names to brand the left, but rather say our contrast is we really do believe in unity. Our unity is we love America. We want America to be accessible to everyone. Doesn't matter whether you're young or old, Black or white, rich or poor, whether you're born here, you came here legally from somewhere else, we don't care. We want you to have access to the same freedoms and the same opportunities that we inherited from past generations. And I think that's a powerful message. And it's one where you talked about that fusion, where true, pure libertarians, I think, can share that sentiment with maybe more classical or traditional conservatives. It's certainly the sort of thing Reagan talked about. Get the government out of my back. He talked as well in that time for choosing speech and reiterated it time and time again with slightly different language, but basically saying, I think in a time for choosing, he said, there's nothing more permanent on earth than a government program, particularly a federal government program. He rechanged that over time to say, government isn't the solution to our problems. It is the problem. I think from that mindset, we say our belief, as we've seen clearly during this past 2 years now almost, where there's some people who think the answer to everything is the government. And time again, we've seen that fail. In the worst cases with absolute hypocrisy, like we saw just the other day in California, where Newsom has this order and local officials have these orders for masks on kids and masks in facilities. And there they sit with Magic Johnson with no mask on. I'm not advocating for masks, but just the absolute hypocrisy versus those of us who believe that individuals and particularly families are much better at making decisions. I think that's a powerful message we've got to echo over and over again.
We have a number of questions, so I'm going to let Laura Cusack, we'll take as many questions as possible in our remaining 10 minutes. So Laura, what do you want to start us with?
Thank you, Roger. We have our first question from Jack, and this question is, why do you think so many Republicans who were formerly Buckley Reagan fusionists were excited to join Trump in his populist pro-big government, anti-free trade, and immigration conservatism? As a libertarian myself, I direct this question to Mr. Boaz, but I'm curious to hear Governor Walker's response as well.
I'm curious to hear Governor Walker's response too. I have to say, I don't know the answer to that. I was surprised. I can tell you that some critics of conservatism say it's because the Republican base was always sitting there disliking immigrants and disliking people from other countries and disliking trade. And finally, somebody gave them what they wanted. I don't want to think that. I want to believe that the Republican base was more Reaganite and even more libertarian, and that somehow some combination of Trump's personality, his outsiderness, I think maybe his opposition to the Iraq War. It turned out you had 15 supporters of the Iraq War on stage with one opponent, well, two, because Rand Paul was there. And I think it turned out there were fewer people who liked the Iraq War than thought. And there was also a tactical issue that Trump was kind of unique there, and he's got a dozen other people in the race, and so he didn't always get a majority. He didn't get a majority in very many primaries, but understandably, all these governors and senators didn't say, well, I'll get out and let somebody else take on Trump. And so there you ended up with Trump getting a plurality a lot of places. But what's your view, Scott?
Governor Walker did get out, but the others stayed in, unfortunately. Unfortunately, the right guy got out and the others stayed in.
Yeah, I often say when people ask me questions about this or similar things, I say Donald Trump wasn't my first pick. I was my first pick. But having said that, obviously at the end, when I looked at Hillary Clinton and I looked at Donald Trump, to me there was no comparison. Not the least of which was his ability to put a replacement on the Supreme Court. Remembering that Scalia was nominated by Ronald Reagan, by Ronald Reagan when I was a kid in school. I knew what an impact that would have, far greater than just 4 years. I think on many policies, I was pleasantly surprised, certainly in the tax cuts, some of the regulatory reform, some of the tone, certainly as a Midwesterner, was remarkably different than I would have. But I think to your point, David, about the populist, I saw under Obama, there was such frustration, not only against Obama and how far radically the left had gone. Because remember, Obama once said he looked up to Ronald Reagan. I think I'm paraphrasing it. And many in the media portrayed that, were surprised, thinking that he admired him on policy. He did. What Barack Obama admired about Ronald Reagan was how transformational he was on the right, and he wanted to do that on the left. And I think sadly, in many regards, with Obamacare, with a number of other policies, they did just that. And so primary Republican-leaning voters wanted someone as aggressive as possible who was going to do that. But the other point people forget about is 2 years before the 2016 election, Republicans took hold of the Senate again to go along with the House. And I think there were many primary voters, I saw it firsthand out across the nation, who felt like, particularly on repeal and replace of Obamacare, that Republican Senate candidates had made a promise. And remember, late in 2015, they still hadn't delivered on that. Of course, in Washington, their claim was, well, Obama's going to veto it. But voters said, I don't care. I don't believe you guys. I think even Republicans aren't strong enough on this issue. And they heard Donald Trump on a whole series of issues be aggressive. I think on trade and immigration, to your point earlier, I still believe the vast majority of voters in America, particularly Republican voters, believe in free trade and believe in immigration. What they're hung up on is fairness. They don't think it's fair to come in illegally. They think there should be a legitimate legal process by which people come in this country. And I think that's it's certainly consistent with myself. And on trade, I think most people do want fair trade, but what they've seen for decades in both Republican and Democrat administrations is that we haven't had free trade. Even for those talking about free trade, we have all these restrictions. I think the best line I heard out of Donald Trump came when he was up in Canada at the G7, and he, maybe aggressively, but said, I'll get rid of all of our restrictions on any form of trade as long as you do. Well, of course, they all didn't take that offer. But I think those of us who have libertarian tendencies would have loved it. That would have been a great deal. And certainly the sort of thing Reagan talked about. But when they hear free trade, that usually means some gigantic document with all sorts of restrictions that's maybe less restrictive. So in the end, I still think free trade that really is free and immigration that's based on legal immigration are still things that even Republican leading voters are open to.
Thank you. We have our next question from Kobe. How do we ensure that US elections don't turn into madness and mayhem going forward? And who is the right person to lead the US in 2024?
Scott, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I think on elections, and this has been an issue long before 2020. I signed a bill 10 years ago that required voter identification. The left went nuts. They said it would suppress the vote. In 2020, at least in Wisconsin, we had more than 75% of the eligible adults, legal age voting adults, were able to vote, the highest turnout in more than 70 years. So clearly it didn't restrict that. But I think to not repeat some of the challenges we've had, not just in 2020, but in the past, you've got to have the combination of integrity and transparency. One of the biggest problems I think that came out of places like Detroit, Philadelphia, other places across the country was when they were doing the post-election recounts or counts, they closed it off to the media. I think you need to have absolute transparency, and transparency breeds legitimacy. And when people can see what's going on, when they can't see what's going on, whether there was or wasn't problems, it just breeds discontent. So I think make it clear, make it easy to vote, but hard to cheat, and make it as transparent as possible.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time here, you don't have to tell us who you're hoping or wanting to think will run in 2024, David.
Let me make a small, I mean, I agree basically with what Scott said. We want it to be easy to vote and hard to cheat, definitely. I think, in fact, it's pretty easy to vote and it's pretty hard to cheat. So I'm not that worried about the situation there. I am worried about efforts to replace honest secretaries of state with people committed to making sure that the right guy wins the next election. And one thing that both parties ought to be able to do right now is to reform the Electoral College Act of 1887, which was poorly worded, poorly designed, and gave an opportunity for somebody to tell Mike Pence that he, as vice president, could just throw out the votes he didn't like and declare the election thrown into the House of Representatives. Commendably, he didn't do that. But let's make the wording of the Electoral Act more clear about how the electoral votes come in and what it means to count them, not to decide on them. And there are people in both parties working on that right now.
David, and I would just add to that, I think you're exactly right. I looked at that repeatedly because Mike Pence, for example, speaks at some of our events, and not often, but occasionally I'll get someone who pushes back on that. And I say, well, wasn't one of the strengths of the Trump and Pence administration that they put good jurists on the federal courts? And I said, yes. And then I'd say, well, part of their strength was they upheld the Constitution. They didn't make it do what they wanted or what they thought it should do, like we so often criticize the left. They upheld the Constitution. I pull out my pocket Constitution, which, by the way, comes from CATO, and I point out to them, where in the Constitution does it say the president and the Senate, which is the vice president, can do anything other than open the ballots from the electors from the states? That's all he or she can do. And I think you're right, reinforcing what the Constitution actually says is important.
Well, I think we have time for another.
I think we have time for one last question, and this one comes from Elizabeth. There is a large anti-conservative movement because of Trumpism media coverage. How do you see the young conservatives separate themselves from that popular perception?
Well, certainly the key when we're working with young people all the time is to talk about ideas, not just personalities, even beyond Reagan. Certainly we admire Reagan. We have links to Reagan with the properties that we have. But in the larger context, it's talking about big ideas. And what I'm pleased to find is that I think overwhelmingly, there's a reason why cancel culture is so prevalent, is because they don't want to have an even playing field. When people hear about economic, religious, personal freedoms, when they look at, say, how many of you want to start your own business someday? Hands go up. I said, well, do you want the government dictating everything? No, they don't want that any more than they want their parents or anybody else telling what to do. So I think there is a bit, students aren't just liberal. That's all. They're liberal largely because that's all they've heard. I think they actually have, David, you appreciate this, a bit more of a libertarian trend. I think we need to act on that. If anyone is pessimistic about this generation, I'll tell you, the last speech I gave before COVID a couple of years ago was at Stanford University. 3 of the students who organized it, I had pulled aside to ask them a little bit about their backgrounds. One of them was someone who came from a Democrat household, very liberal parents. He told me he learned about this by listening and reading about conservative, freedom-based ideas, got involved with YAF, other groups on campus. The punchline with that is not just that it's a great story in its own right. The punchline is that John, that student, happens to be the son of Susan Rice, who's now a very thoughtful conservative. Why? Because we broke through the nonsense out there and actually talked about freedom in its truest sense. And he, like I think so many others, were drawn to that. We just got to get to more students, get to them at younger ages, and be even more effective in how we communicate that message.
David, I don't know if you want to add anything other than that sounded like a good pitch for your books.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You should read my book and become a libertarian, and then nobody will associate you with Trump. But if you want to be a Reagan conservative, and you do believe in individual rights and free trade and all those things, at some point, you got to speak up and say, Trump is not what we're about. And Republicans haven't been willing to do that, but young conservatives could.
Well, thank you very, very much to both of you for participating in this webinar this afternoon. We hope we've ignited the interest of any students listening today to consider not only you obviously should participate in Young America's Foundation programs. CATO Institute has some great programs for college students, their intern program, but also consider our Liberty and Learning fellowships at the Fund for American Studies. We have a range of programs this summer for college students to come spend the summer in Washington, living, learning, and interning, and getting on a track where you can be involved in protecting liberty throughout your careers. Thank you, Governor Walker. Thank you, my friend David Boaz. Appreciate you being with us, and look forward to doing something like this again on another occasion.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right.